TV is a one-way medium. It's a passive medium. It's perfect for brainwashing people. Your brain actually goes into a different delta or theta or whatever state. And you're just like, and you certainly are not engaged despite the people yelling at the TV, et cetera. And that's why I prefer forums like the podcast, like Twitter, like things that are interactive. But all of a sudden, like the network shows were all just the same with the less laugh tracks.
Yeah.
And, it's just like, oh man, this is just
commercials.
So yeah. I mean,
advertising.
It was just horrible, really horrible. And so my wife and I, essentially, when we moved into our first house, we didn't buy a TV because we were just like, fuck that. I mean, it's just gotten so bad.
Hi, I'm Jim O'Shaughnessy, and welcome to Infinite Loops. Sometimes we get caught up in what feel like infinite loops when trying to figure things out. Markets go up and down, research is presented and then refuted, and we find ourselves right back where we started. The goal of this podcast is to learn how we can reset our thinking on issues that hopefully leaves us with a better understanding as to why we think the way we think and how we might be able to change that to avoid going in infinite loops of thought. We hope to offer our listeners a fresh perspective on a variety of issues and look at them through a multifaceted lens, including history, philosophy, art, science, linguistics, and yes, also through quantitative analysis. And through these discussions, help you not only become a better investor, but also become a more nuanced thinker. With each episode, we hope to bring you along with us as we learn together. Thanks for joining us. Now please enjoy this episode of Infinite Loops.
Jim O'Shaughnessy is Chairman and Co-Chief Investment Officer of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management, where Jamie Catherwood is an associate. All opinions expressed by Jim, Jamie, and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Clients of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with another episode of Infinite Loops. And you might be saying, wait a minute, Jim. I heard you already introduce these guys. You talked about how incredibly great both of them are. Of course, I'm talking about Trung Phan and Rob Henderson, both of whom I've had on the podcast before. But this one was basically got started from a tweet. I think it was yours, Trung, right? No, Rob, you had done something on The Shield. Trung was like, hey, let's all jump on a podcast and talk about TV. And so that's what we're going to do today. However, listeners and viewers, as you probably know, we talk a lot before we actually hit record. And Trung and I learned what really Rob should consider like a deep, dark secret that he should not utter in any format. And Trung, I'm going to toss it to you, let you tell the people what it was.
Well, I'll say what the situation was. So we just found out that Rob Henderson, who consumes more television than anybody else I know and writes about it brilliantly, has never seen the movie Apocalypse Now, and which is Francis Ford Coppola's 1979 Vietnam War movie. But there's actually, so I don't want to throw Rob under the bus here. So what I want to say is this. Rob, are there any other movies of this ilk that you have not seen? And is it more like not?
It's nothing against the genre or anything. I mean, I've heard good things about this movie. It's just one of those things that it's funny. I just literally saw The Godfather, the first Godfather movie, I think maybe 5 months ago when it was released in the theaters, in the cinema here, as they say.
The
50th anniversary. And I put this on Twitter. I said, hey, I just saw the first Godfather movie. It was as good as people say. And I got all these comments saying, like, what the hell's wrong with you? You just now saw The Godfather? Like, that movie's been out forever. Like, you watch The Sopranos and you've never seen The Godfather? Like, how is this possible? Like, because in the first season of Sopranos, it's like every other episode they make a reference to The Godfather.
Yeah.
And just never got around to it. I'm like, oh, I'm glad I watched that. So I think this is just one of those things where this movie came out before my time and somehow, I just haven't got around to it. But you guys are convincing me. When was this movie released, Apocalypse Now?
1979. It was the fourth movie in a 7-year run that Francis Ford Coppola had. It's the greatest run in film history. He made Godfather in 1972, The Conversation and Godfather 2 in 1974, and then Apocalypse Now in 1979, which I'll bring up this point. Jim mentioned it, but there's a documentary about the making of Apocalypse Now. It's called The Heart of Darkness. So Jim, why is it called The Heart of Darkness? And what does that documentary tell you about the filmmaking experience? Because it is one of the craziest stories in Hollywood history.
It really is. And I got it from Jed McKenna, who I've read everything he's written. I love his work. And he literally, in one of his books, he has the complete deconstruction, not only of Apocalypse Now, but he said the superior documentary about the making of it, The Heart of Darkness, obviously called that because Apocalypse Now is based on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which is an excellent book. If you haven't read it, I would definitely pick it up and read it. And basically what happened to Coppola was he contemplated suicide daily at the end. Everybody abandoned him, all of his financing, the government that was swore that they would work with him.
The Filipino government, the Marcos regime.
Yes. And literally he willed this movie into existence. And he spent his own money. His wife continued to support him, but it put him through a hell. And this is why Jed McKenna's interested about it. He says, essentially, McKenna's all about, the death and rebirth of enlightenment and all that sort of thing. And he said, basically, that's what happened to him. And he goes, everybody, we were talking about The Godfather as well. And he's like, yeah, The Godfather is good. I mean, it's really good, but it's like kind of standard programming, classic gangster story. Whereas Apocalypse Now, man, it's like, well, we'll have to have you back on after you watch it, Rob, because
that would be an incredible thing.
We could do 2 hours just on that movie and the documentary, because it was one of those like seminal works, kind of back to when movie making was still like in its highest art form. And we're going to be talking more today about TV and sort of the golden age of TV that happened. I strike it at The Wire, but many strike it at The
Sopranos, 99, yeah.
Okay. When you say strike it, you mean like The Wire is the high point?
No, the beginning, Rob. Again, and so this is where somebody my age has relevance here, because like what you saw was network TV. They call it TV programming for a reason, right? I'm always on, my high horse about, listen, TV is a one-way medium. It's a passive medium. It's perfect for brainwashing people. Your brain actually goes into a different delta or theta or whatever state. And you're just like, and you certainly are not engaged despite the people yelling at the TV, et cetera. And that's why I prefer forums like the podcast, like Twitter, like things that are interactive. But all of a sudden, like the network shows were all just the same with the last laugh tracks. Yeah. And, it's just like, oh man, this is just
commercials.
So yeah. I mean,
advertising.
It was just horrible, really horrible. And so my wife and I, essentially, when we moved into our first house, we didn't buy a TV because we were just like, fuck that. I mean, it's just gotten so bad. And then my brother, thinking he was doing us this wonderful favor, bought us a TV like 3 years later. And so I started watching Seinfeld reruns by that time, right? And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. This is really good. And so, of course, you can't paint with a broad brush. All in the Family was an amazing show that essentially, brought the whole class conflicts in America into a humorous viewpoint, and lots of other great network shows. But then they just kind of started to go like this, and then all of a sudden the pay services come on, like HBO, kind of the king at this time, and The Wire. When you first watch The Wire, it's like it is so multi-dimensional, contextually rich, that they just, in the making of the show, they assume that the people who are going to be watching it are smart enough to keep all of these different thread lines together. But you haven't seen The Wire, yeah, Rob?
I've seen The Wire. Yeah. So I saw The Wire about 10 or 11 years ago. So that was 2010, 2011, that era. That was like the peak of the torrenting period, where it was so easy to go to the Pirate Bay or BitTorrent or like, I don't know, they also had like these weird ones, like, Mega, I don't know, like Mega Torrent, these kind of things. And yeah, I torrented all of the HBO shows. I watched The Wire. I probably was not, I think I might not have been mature enough or sophisticated enough to truly understand the greatness of what I was seeing at that point, and I need to revisit it. But I do remember the main characters and the cast and how unique the show was in that, yeah, it didn't treat you like you were an idiot. And they didn't do like flashbacks. They didn't like speak in ways to remind you of who the characters were. Like a lot of the, basic cable dramas and stuff, they'll like say the name of the characters in ways that you don't, I wouldn't say, hey, Jim, every time I spoke to you to like remind the audience that your name is Jim. They don't do that in more sort of high level prestige dramas where people speak in a more natural way. And then, yeah, like the dealers and the Barksdale crew and all those guys, like they spoke the way that drug dealers speak and narcotics trafficking, and they just like, yeah, you don't understand any of this, viewer at home, but you're just going to have to deal with it because that's how life is on the street.
Yeah. And how about you, Trung? Are you a fan, or are we going to move on?
I was actually, I'm a huge fan of The Wire. Massive.
Does not
I started
surprise
watching it right when it came out. I'll tell you why I got into The Wire, actually. My favorite show in the 90s. So I've read Rob's stuff about how, Rob, you used television to kind of teach yourself about society and class just based on your background. And we exchanged some messages. And I was kind of the same because my parents, Vietnamese refugees to Canada, and like they didn't really understand Western society. So they kind of just popped me in front of TVs, right? Like my after school standard was always, it was between 3 and 4. I got home from school. I watched back to back for about five years to a decade. It was The Simpsons and Fresh Prince. Like that was the combination I did every single day after school. And listen, today I'm hoity-toity with my kid. I'm like, I'll never let my kids do that, even though I give my kid like an hour YouTube a day. And anytime my kid pipes up, it's YouTube, right? But my parents are in a different situation. But the reason I bring all this up is because I've read so much of Rob's stuff about television. As you were speaking, Rob, you said you got into Wire a little bit later. I know you've written a lot about The Sopranos and a lot about Mad Men. What it made me realize actually is like there's kind of two ways to look at prestige TV, right? There's breadth, there's depth. This is a video I saw from The Ringer, which is brilliant. But like, what are two of the biggest shows in the last 20 years that are breadth-wise? It would be Game of Thrones and The Wire. You're building worlds, right? Whereas a lot of your writing is about the depth. It's about the character. You're drilling into these characters, right? Because you're a psychology guy. You're interested in the human psychology. It's right in your Twitter bio. It's like Tony Soprano is a character study. The Shield is a character study about Mackie. And Mad Men is a character study, right? And those, actually Mad Men's interesting because that kind of binds both because it's building the world of the 60s and the advertising world.
Yeah.
But with an individual character study. I noticed with a lot of your writing does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I guess I'm drawn to those kinds of prestige dramas where it focuses on a handful of specific characters, goes into backstory, goes into their hidden motives and sort of what shaped their decisions to do the things that they do that you see on the show. I suppose, yeah. I mean, The Shield was interesting in that I guess in a way it never really achieved the same heights as some of these other prestige dramas. It never achieved the heights of Sopranos or The Wire, even though I think it is in the same category as them. But perhaps one of the reasons is because it doesn't maybe necessarily align with either one of those, breadth or depth. You never really see the Vic Mackey character, the detective in The Shield. You never really learn about his backstory. There's one episode in particular where he meets his former supervisor, like this senior detective who's played by, I always Carl Weathers, Apollo Creed, plays the senior detective who trained Vic Mackey back in the 1980s when he was a rookie cop. And you see, like, this guy is basically just as corrupt as Vic is. And I guess the viewer is supposed to infer that, like, oh, Vic learned to be kind of, he learned to cut corners and to partner with criminals and so forth from the Carl Weathers character. But generally, it didn't really, I mean, like, the world itself is East Los Angeles, like this poor rundown part of the city. Whereas, these other shows, like, it really delves deep into, and it uses like different methods to do it. So, I mean, famously, I think Tony Soprano with his therapy, I mean, like, that was just like such a groundbreaking plot device to show like the mind of a mafia boss and a mobster who's also a family man at home. And he has all these complaints and quibbles with his underlings, and to just like air all of his grievances out in this therapist's office while the audience gets to watch was just really, I think, just an incredible way to peek into his mind.
Yeah. So this is going to be, I think, like Control and Cats, which I love. But what I'd like to start with is kind of that very notion. And then hopefully we can take the conversation into, these great TV shows, why they're great, what we learn from them, but then broaden it to kind of think about what I've been thinking a lot about recently, which is, what's the future of media? What's the future of these various entertainment shows? Because I personally have a pretty straightforward view about it, but I'm going to be interested to hear yours. What I'd like to start with, though, referred to it, and it's your New York Times op-ed, Rob, about everything you know about elite America you learn by watching TV. So I think that this is really interesting. And can you talk to us a little bit about that? The two that you specifically mentioned, Fresh Prince, which I've never seen, and West Wing, which I adored. So, but go.
Jim, you've never seen The Fresh Prince.
That's
I
as
would
bad
say
as Apocalypse Now.
that's at least as egregious as Nothing Apocalypse Now. It's seeing, this 4-season sitcom from the 90s. I mean, okay. So that piece, that was interesting. That started in a different way. I actually submitted this op-ed to my contact at the New York Times. I had this piece about the fair admissions Harvard affair with this group of Asian American students that was suing Harvard. And I just wanted to weigh in and give my 2 cents on it. I wrote, 800 words about it. And I had 2 sentences in there about class and TV. They were just throwaway lines. The editor was like, all this other stuff is everyone else is talking about it, but these 2 sentences here, could you build an op-ed around that? And I was like, this is just how the sausage is made with these kinds of things. And I'm like, all right, I guess. And I really started thinking about it and reflecting, and I realized wow, some 60 or 70% of my childhood, I feel was spent just consuming TV shows. And The Fresh Prince in particular was a big one. I watched some others too. I watched Roseanne and, what else was Power Rangers, those kinds of shows too, the kids shows. But yeah, the things that stood out from the sitcoms of that period were anytime there were teenage characters in high school, there's always the special episode where these kids are I'm applying to college, and what do we get? There's a boyfriend and girlfriend. What are we gonna do when we go away to college? And I'm people. Okay, so I'm watching this, and I'm 8 years old, and I'm okay, so people go away to college. But then I'm looking around me at the 18-year-old burnouts who go to my local high school, and I'm they're not going away to anywhere. So what's going on? There's
jail, right?
Yeah, some of them are going to jail or going away to but none of them are going off to college to some leafy green campus. The way that the people in these shows were in Fresh Prince, you see Will Smith character, and Carlton, going back and forth about whether Carlton's going to go off to Princeton or whether he's going to go to UCLA or whatever. And I'm okay, but Carlton's already rich, right? The Banks family, Uncle Phil, Aunt Viv, they live in this massive house. Will's always cracking jokes about how he's going to take Uncle Phil's, Lambo out for a spin. And I'm okay, so these guys are super rich. They have a butler. Uncle Phil has a Lambo and a Ferrari. And, Carlton is stressing out about going to Princeton. And I'm why does he want to go to Princeton? They're already rich. They have money. They're already well off. And I watch shows later I watched this show, these other, the OC was another one about this rich family. And the teenage characters are all stressing about, am I going to go to Berkeley or Brown or whatever? And again, these are rich people. And I started to realize okay, so college is really this important thing. Even if you're from a well-to-do family, even if you have a butler, there's still all this pressure and expectations from your family that you should go to college. And it sort of impressed upon me the importance of education. It didn't really have as strong of an effect as my actual environment, because I didn't end up going to college right after high school. I barely graduated and joined the military. But then even when I was in the military, I was watching TV shows. I watched The West Wing, which I talk about in that New York Times piece. And that was an interesting show for me because, even that show underscored the differences in the category of higher education, the institutions within higher education. There's a scene where CJ Craig, who's the White House communications, she works on, anyway, she's in the administration. She talks to the president, President Bartlett, says, Mr. President, you got into Harvard and Yale and Williams, but you chose to go to Notre Dame. Why would you go there? And, he said something about how he wanted to train to be a Catholic priest, and that was the best way to go or something like that. And I was watching this thinking okay, so he's the president of the United States, the hardest, most prestigious job in the world. And, one of his underlings is you got into Harvard, Yale, and all these other fancy places. Why didn't you go to them? He clearly did okay in his life. He's the president. And still they're interrogating him about his choice of college. And that was I guess an inkling for me of okay, so college, where you choose to go is also important, and people's, at least within this sort of social strata, judge you based on your choice of where you choose to go. And then like within the shows that I was watching, I was also picking up on these, and these implicit cues about like the ways that people spoke and the stress that people felt about being found out. So a simple example is in The Sopranos, where Tony, he lives in this upper middle class neighborhood full of doctors and lawyers, but he's the boss of a crime organization, so he clearly didn't make his money the same way as them. And the Cusamanos, his next door neighbor, who's his family physician, Dr. Cusimano invites Tony to go golfing with him and his doctor and lawyer friends. And the entire time they're like cracking jokes about, hey, like, something about like sleeping with the fishes, or like, hey, have you ever heard about, so-and-so and John Gotti, and making all of these like kind of sly remarks. And Tony's clearly uncomfortable because he's used to being around a bunch of other thugs, talking about, ripping someone off or beating someone up or whatever. And so I'm watching this and I can sense Tony's discomfort. He didn't go to college. He has no idea what these guys are talking about with the stock market and so forth. And so I would pick up on these kinds of things and like slowly reflect on my own kind of class background and where I wanted to go in my own life.
Yeah. So the thing about that scene in Sopranos, which I've loved and I've watched more than once, was the fascination of the upper classes with that type of character. If you know American history, it's shot full of this type of veneration. So Al Capone, for example, gave press conferences. And like everybody knew what he did, everybody. And like he was this huge celebrity and hero to the people. Same way with the old Western motifs. Everyone was rooting for the bad guys, Bonnie and Clyde, same kind of thing. And I kind of think that's part of like the American experience, so to speak, in terms of like no limits and people kind of fantasizing about, wouldn't it be kind of cool for just one day to like have Tony, and back to Tony Soprano, one of the most effective scenes, at least for me, was when Dr. Melfi, his psychiatrist, got raped, and he knew that she could have her rapist killed. And
she had the power. She saw where he worked, right?
Yes,
that was amazing.
Oh, yeah.
I remember that scene, like the power she had. She's like, I could kill this guy. Have this guy killed.
And remembering, because I haven't watched it for a while, but it really made a huge impression on me, that show, the entire show. And like the scene was so artistically and beautifully shot. And again, this is kind of this golden era, because it's true of Mad Men, it's true of The Sopranos, it's true of Breaking Bad, it's true of a lot of these shows where the people making the show are making huge assumptions about the intelligence of their audience. And I think that's really interesting. You just kind of, my wife and I are watching Better Call Saul, which is the prequel to Breaking Bad. And like, we watched the 9th episode last night, and like, there's a scene between Saul and his wife in a garage. I turned to my wife, and just by looking at the way he's filming it and the body language and everything, I looked at my wife and I said, she's going to leave it. And then instead of that, she comes and kisses him quite passionately. And I go, guess I was wrong. Cut to the next scene. She's leaving. So this visual vocabulary that has been developed, and I think will get continually developed. There's a great book on it called Unflattening, on how we're merging the ability to visually make statements that are really incredibly profound. And I thought immediately, thinking about the podcast today, about that Melfi scene where it's just her face, and then kind of like the end that everybody hated, it just kind of went to black. And like, but you saw in her expression, no, I will not fall. I will not join the violence as much as I want to. And so like, I know you're a Sopranos fan as well. So all three of us are. What are your major takeaways? Like if I said, hey man, what did you learn from this? What would you say to me?
Like moral lessons, or like my actual enjoyment?
No, the real lessons. This is a zone podcast.
So I watched it, actually. My experience of watching it was not very intellectual, right? Like I watched it with my college buddies in the early 2000s. It was like our thing to do. It's like every Friday we just sit down, get hammered, and watch The Sopranos. It was just extremely entertaining.
But isn't that part of the brilliance of the show, right? Is that you can watch it on those two levels.
Yeah.
I did the same thing. 10 years ago, I watched The Sopranos. I got drunk with my military buddies. We drink, Keystone and Milwaukee's Best and just like go through a case of beer and watch The Sopranos. I watched it over the lockdown in a much, in my sort of academic lens when I'm writing about it and tweeting about it and stuff. And like suddenly I've become, this like sophisticated, look, what does this scene mean? What's the subtext here? But you can enjoy it in both levels. Like that's the brilliance of these shows.
You know what? I bet a lot of listeners on this call will have a similar experience where they watched a show like The Wire, Breaking Bad, or Sopranos before they had their current partner or spouse, and then they made their partner and spouse watch it. So I got a chance to rewatch The Wire and Sopranos with my wife. But as we will talk about later, because we need to pin this here. What are the rules about watching something with someone? You can't just race ahead, right? But I started rewatching my wife, and she's like, "This is too good," and she'd rip off like 10 episodes a day, and then I never got a chance to do the intellectual rewatch. But you're right. Brilliance is like you watch it like for pure enjoyment. But you mentioned in some of your writing too, which I really enjoyed. Is like you love reading recaps, right? I'm the same. I love reading show recaps, and I guess that was the intellectual part. I'd watch it for pure enjoyment. And then the recap, I would just steal like the moral lessons from the writers and like pawn them off as my own. Like, oh yeah, when Tony did this, he was indicating that he was a family man. That's my thing.
So you're making it until you're making it, right?
Yeah.
Well, so there is like the moral lesson. Like one was what Jim said about Melfi saying no. The first time I saw that, I think I had the same response as like, all the guys I was watching it with too. We were like, what are you like? We all were like, yeah, Tony's going to kill this motherfucker. And then at the end, we're like, what? Are you kidding? And then I rewatched it this time. And like, suddenly I realized like through, I guess, sort of maturation, taking a more intellectual lens and then reading all the recaps and like understanding there's a different way to watch television. Yeah. I realized that, like if Melfi had gotten entangled with the mafia, like she herself might not have survived the series. You know what I mean? Like once she is indebted to Tony and his crew, like who knows what direction that show could have taken. But by saying no, she actually potentially saved her life and her family's life. You know what I mean? And that was a sort of a moral decision.
So which it fascinates me from a number of different levels because first off, it is entertaining. So let's make sure of that, right?
Yeah.
Like one of my big things is everybody's in the entertainment business, whether they know it or not. And if you are not entertaining in some way, honestly, it just doesn't matter. You're not going to break through even to the target group that you hope to break through to. So being entertaining is kind of table stakes. But then when you start like looking at the lessons of a Sopranos or a Wire, it just keeps going back, man. And it gets back to like Greek myth about making deals with the bad demons or the devil in Christianity and all of these things, which have been like in our DNA. The stories just keep getting told, but they're the same story, basically. I mean, it's like Campbell's Hero's Journey. All of the most popular movies, guess what, are hero's journeys because it's in our base code and it's our way of learning. And that people don't like naturally think about this. Then you start thinking about the fact that it's on a conscious level, right? But it's also on a very deep unconscious level. And I read this quote from another guy who I think was way ahead of his time, Robert Anton Wilson. And he's saying this many years ago. And here's what he said. He's like, if all of the TV shows about the police, 20 a week when he wrote this, went off the air and instead were replaced with an equal number of shows about landlords, how would this change the average American's reality tone? What you got for me? Either guy. I'll go with you, Rob.
So all the TV shows about cops are replaced with landlords. I don't know. Well, I don't know. Maybe today we'd be talking about defunding the landlords, but I don't know. Like it's well, actually, we kind of. I think there is this sort of hostility that people have towards landlords in general. But I think probably for a period. This is my very first impression here is that people would be more divided on it, where a lot of people would have more sympathy for landlords. I mean, especially you could probably do an entertaining show about a landlord who has the family, who's trying to get by, and like he's been screwed over a few times by his tenants, and you feel sympathy for him. Like, there's a way you could make that show interesting and get people to sort of identify with that profession. Yeah, I don't know. And then, but then I could also imagine this sort of a backlash to it, where members of the intelligentsia would write stories about how we're too sympathetic to the landlords. These TV shows are brainwashing us. We're not realizing how much they're screwing over the tenants.
But here's what I think, that what he's making is a much deeper, and he has a really good sense of humor. And so I think the point he's making is a little more profound. It is, whether we realize it or acknowledge it or not, we are, bombarded every day, every single day, by the societal influence that in some ways it is open and honest, right? But in most ways, and by the way, not a conspiracy, this is just the way things work, right? Where the Overton window opens and then closes, right? When it's open on something, everyone's like, yeah, that's right. When it's closes, then no one talks about it. And so the way I look at it is, if you've got to try to, when you get that, when you understand that, you've got to try to unlearn a lot of messages that you don't like, that you kind of might be thinking are your messages, right? Many times they're not yours. I did something over the weekend that my wife is always long suffering, because she's just like, man, why are you doing this? Right. And it was because I was interested. Anyway, I played nothing but 1950 swooning crooner songs on these bad boys. And I watched TV shows from the 50s, and I emerged terrified, because that world, man, was it from our viewpoint today. That was a simulacron. I can never say that word, simulacron, that the powers that be were totally controlling. Totally. There's a Diana, whatever, I can't remember her last name, song that's you're okay. It's all right. You feel fine. It's a good day to pay your bills. And I'm listening.
It's a good day to pay your taxes. Fine.
What? It's a good day to be a good American. And good Americans do this and this. And then you watch the TV shows, same thing. And it's and I just couldn't help but thinking about the, the Truman Show, for example. And she was like, okay, so what did you learn, smart guy? And I'm what I learned is I'm really happy that I'm alive today and not back then, because my guess is that was normal to them. And then, of course, I always try to put a time travel spin on it because I love sci-fi. If you didn't do that, if you didn't prepare to go back to a period that many people think of as just a little while ago, right? The 1950s. And of course, Back to the Future, famous. They made some pretty good observations there, but you would, your fellow humans, you wouldn't get it. You'd be going, what are you doing to this poor woman? Keeping her, in an apron in the kitchen. What the fuck is going on? Right. And so I think that with the ability and the tools that we have right now today that are only going to expand, we're going to just start seeing a lot of really incredibly creative stuff, including shows. Trung, you're working on one. And what do you guys think? Do you think that the shows we're talking about, we're pretty much heavily staying on the Sopranos here. I want to maybe switch gears to a Mad Men, because it's a completely different idea. But are those still, because the other thing I learned, right, when I was doing my deep 50s dive, and I'm was back then, it was so much easier to program society, right? There were two newspapers that mattered, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. That was it. And there were 3 networks, and that was it, man. And they decided, Monty Python has a bit about it, and Saturday Night Live, I think, had a bit about it, about, the nefarious doings of the network people. Let's get them to believe this. And anyway, now, and for example, the war on drugs, what a fucking pile of horse shit that was. If you only looked at empirical evidence from drug trials, right, and you had no name on what the drug was, and you were just looking at the numbers, alcohol would be illegal, psychedelics would be legal. And so back then, though, Nixon was terrified because he was not in a good place. By the way, he is my vote, and this includes Trump. He is my vote for craziest motherfucker to ever occupy the White House.
He was drunk half the time, right? Yeah, Trump was a controller, so there's that part.
He was smashed and hammered like all the time. And
They
like,
have tapes. They have tapes of him hammered.
I know. And like, it's like, I'm kind of like, why aren't people like listening to this? Why isn't somebody making a movie about this? My friend Ron Howard made Frost Nixon, which I thought was really good, by the way. But anyway, do you see this as like, the final point I wanted to make was back then you could control society pretty much stem to stern. And like I Love Lucy had 68 million viewers every week.
Yeah.
The most recent show that had any number above 15 million was Game of Thrones finale, which had 18 million viewers. Right. So this atomizing of the various uniform culture into these subgroups, a lot of people go on about, the tribal nature. And yeah, that's true. When you're talking about big tribes, right? Like political tribes or religious tribes or anything like that. But I think it's kind of interesting what we might be seeing coming out of the next 10 to 20 years. Thoughts? Trung, I'm going to start with you, man.
I think Rob's chomping on a bit here. Rob, go nuts.
Okay, go ahead.
I mean, so it's interesting what you said earlier about the immersing yourself in the 1950s and the sitcoms and how they were programming people to think in certain ways, to be happy and to pay their bills and so forth. There was an interesting Substack recently by this guy, Eric Hole. I think he's a neuroscientist by training. I mean, he's interesting writer. And he recently shared this post about this sort of how culture, pop culture specifically, seems to be becoming more dark, gradually more dark over time. And he suggests that, of course, in the 1950s, these shows were portraying people as happier than people probably really were. And maybe part of the programming was like, hey, everything's cool, be happy, be cheerful. But Eric also suggests that the TV shows today seem to be going in the opposite direction, where they show this sort of bleak and cynical outlook that the TV show characters have. And probably people aren't quite that self-interested and that cynical in real life either. Like we've almost swung in the other direction now where, you see like Walter White or Tony Soprano, and you see they're completely self-interested in dark motives. And that's not really how people, like everyday people, are either, right? Like we're not quite at that level of ambition and avarice and brutality. And so I find this interesting too, that like where the culture tends to go, I think probably in the 1950s, the aim was to probably get people to be happy, to be cheerful, to think in certain ways. Is that the aim now, though, with TV? When we watch these sort of dark prestige dramas on HBO or Netflix or something, like, is the aim to also get people to be more cynical, to second guess people's motives and so forth? So that was just something that had come to mind too, is like, is the programming motive still present in TV?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'd love to tackle that because I was just thinking about what you're talking about, Jim, how the fracturing and of attention and inability to kind of control, or as Chomsky says, manufacture consent. I think that is actually super interesting. It's a little bit sad, though, and I'll tell you why it's sad for me. And we talked about it earlier about drinking with your friends for Sopranos. Obviously, I can't do that anymore. And Netflix kind of did this whole thing where you drop whole seasons, though that experience is actually not that satisfying, right? It's so much more satisfying when that's not true. It is satisfying, but it doesn't have lasting effect. So in the last 5 years, what I've really enjoyed is Succession, because it's once a week. Yeah. And I know everybody at FinQuit's watching it. Those are so much more rare, right? And like those memeable moments, that's why Game of Thrones was such a smash, right? And so culturally important. Those are going away. The way Netflix just drops things, it takes away that tension and the build up week by week. I understand how they do it. I think they're potentially going to have to change the model now, especially as they're moving to advertising. But my whole thought was, it is obviously, Jim, to your side, the 1950s, where you get programmed, or you have Walter Cronkite basically convincing America that the Vietnam War is bad. Like after he went to see after the Tet Offensive in 1969, he came back from a visit and just basically went on TV, CBS, said, "Yeah, we can't win this war." And basically, Lyndon Johnson went to his staff, was like, "We just lost Middle America." And then a couple months later, he said, "I'm not running for re-election," right? Like, this was a power you had in the 50s and 60s for a singular entity because of the way the three networks kind of ran media. Obviously, that's not necessarily a good thing. But we've atomized so hard. And the last show that maybe was able to sway public opinion with real tangible effect, I just listened to an amazing podcast, Malcolm Gladwell, talked to Will and Grace. And Will and Grace ran, I think, from 99 to 2009, but like materially, Middle America's opinion about gays and gay marriage. even though the show itself never talked about AIDS, not a single episode, right? And sometimes you have to, this is kind of moderating influence, which is what the networks were. They're like, we joked about how everything in the 90s was kind of bad because they toned everything down or, watered everything down. But to have this cultural effect and have everybody actually appeal to it, I think that's valuable. I don't know what the middle is now, but we've actually gone so far the other way where there's so few shows now where I watch with people. Like, I know you mentioned in our group chat, Rob, Severance. I've seen a lot of people talk about Severance. It's so far down my queue right now. And then the people like, you know what I mean? It's like, it's so hard to get those shows that just from an entertainment side, like how to get everybody excited about it. And then also culturally relevant and maybe even change people's actual opinions. That to me
that that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think I'd never considered what you said about how like releasing one episode a week, the way that Succession and Game of Thrones, the way that HBO, like the HBO model versus the Netflix model of dropping it all at once. I mean, I don't think has there been a single Netflix show that's really had like the cultural impact of any of the HBO shows or the AMC shows, right? Breaking Bad and Mad Men. I mean, I guess House of Cards was kind of big for a while. I can't think anything on Netflix. I guess people talk about Stranger Things, but they don't really have the same kind of cachet as Succession, for example, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I think it matters. I think it matters.
I think I agree with that. I have actually thought about that a little bit, but then again, you also got to get back to scenes, right? And why is Succession so appealing to people? Well, basically because it's King. If you're a Shakespeare fan, and by the way, let's talk about the king of psychology and understanding human OS, Mr. Bill Shakespeare. Like if you read all of his works, man, like I'll defer to you on this one, Rob, but like if that's the way you want to figure out how human OS actually works, as opposed to how it's supposed to work, read Shakespeare, man, because King Lear is Succession. That's what it is. Yeah. It is based on.
So there's a literary critic, Harold Bloom. He was the late Harold Bloom. He recently passed, but he had this line where he said, a lot of people want to do Freudian readings of Shakespeare. You do this sort of like psychoanalytic readings of a fictional text. But he said, if you really want to understand human nature, you should do a Shakespearean reading of Freud. Yeah, right? like Shakespeare got there before Freud, and is basically like the original sort of psychoanalyst, psychologist. So.
Wait, totally. Jim is what? Oh, sorry, I don't want to jump back, Jim. So, Jim, is the point you're making that Succession is culturally relevant just because it's a good show? Because is that kind of the point? It's like it's such a show.
No, actually, the point is because the theme is such a consistent theme.
Okay.
In the recycling of human lives, right? Mm-hmm. So, like essentially, I've also been reading a lot of Will Storr, who he and Rob convinced me that. Seeking status is a thing. I thought that was not true. After reading Rob, after reading like all of Will's books, I now find it to be true, which I had to update my mental.
Your OS?
Of those. Yeah, my OS. I try to update this bad boy as much as I can, but these are just like recurring themes, right? And that's why the hero's journey works, because all of those themes seem to be essential human base code, right? It's like, what do I need to learn about? What do I need to avoid, right? And so Lear and Succession is all based on the powerful patriarch, right? Who fucking makes the worst decisions in the world because he doesn't know who his true allies are. And he is lost up here in a land that I am so great, I don't need anyone else's input, that he's totally not only lost touch with himself, but with everyone who surrounds him.
Yeah.
And the scene that when I'd always kind of thought, and by the way, obviously I love Succession, but I'd always thought when I saw that scene after Kendall kills in the Kennedy
season 1 finale.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
Yes.
Afterward.
Okay.
Yeah, was that like based on the Ted Kennedy, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But the beauty of it was in that final scene where the dad comes in and demonstrates to his
Logan.
son. Yeah. Logan comes in, and the scene between Logan and Kendall, like I watched it 4 times just because I thought it was so brilliant.
Yeah.
And it's like, you poor little dumb shit. You just have no idea about the way the world really works. And in that regard, like Kendall's Logan's right. Like, Kendall was a dipshit. And, he just kind of naturally assumed that he was the heir apparent and all of this stuff. But that's when I kind of looked back and actually went and reread King Lear. And like Lear banishes the only daughter who truly loves him, right? And keeps the daughters who hate his guts and want to, destabilize his regime at every particular moment. And so my point, Trung, is more that the shows that seem to grab us as we kind of talk about this are shows that human beings have been facing these questions and these challenges for all of history, right? First, the reason stories are so powerful is because that's how we told our next generation about things until we learned writing, right? And so the Iliad, the Odyssey, all of these things were just like baked into our DNA. I think that's why, like, if you're looking, I put up a tweet. It's like, why does Hollywood just keep making the same fucking movies over and over and over and over and over again? Why? Because just a financial consideration. And man, there are infinite stories that are awesome. There are infinite stories out of copyright, right? That are awesome. Like Dan Brown did it with the Da Vinci Code. Like, I'm a huge history nerd. And like, when I first was reading the book, I'm like, wait a minute. I've like read about this. And so, yeah, he just went and he ransacked history and he made it entertaining. But the point is, the reason these things resonate with us is because these are the kind of the eternal things that we humans have to deal with. And we have to try to figure out which way do I go here? And so I think that the brilliant mix of being entertaining, like both of you guys watching with your buddies, watching in a very different frame of mind, and then coming back to and like watching a little more, closely to see what it's all about, is I just think that's going to be interesting. I don't know, to Trung's point though, I don't know if it's going to be enough to like move the needle for us as a society. Whichever one of you guys want to jump in on that, go ahead.
I would love to hear Rob's put his lens of the signaling of Succession, just based on everything Jim said. Like, well, you know how you put this lens about what Fresh Prince told you to think about, what was important. Well, have you watched Succession and thought about what these characters are telling you what's important? Please.
I mean, I love Succession too. Recently watched it, the first 3 seasons. And yeah, I thought it was brilliant. I mean, so it's so funny that Jim, you brought up King Lear. I just saw King Lear here. So they're doing the Cambridge Shakespeare Festival. So they do these outdoor Shakespearean plays here at the Cambridge colleges. And I was watching it with Succession in mind this time. And I thought to myself, with Succession, an interesting direction to take it would be, so spoiler alert for a 400-year-old story with King Lear. But, basically the 2 evil daughters throw King Lear out of his own kingdom. Like once he divides the kingdom between Goneril and Regan, the 2 evil daughters, they basically treat him like shit. They throw him out. They say like, get out of here, old man. You and your 100 servants can go somewhere else. And he's stripped of all of his power. And I wonder if Succession will, maybe in the final season, some Kendall or the other kids will take over Roystar Waco, throw Logan out, and will he have to basically be this sort of like blinded king who is paying for his sins of treating his kids so poorly that, naturally, eventually he was going to be stripped of his power and his kids were going to betray him. I think that would be an interesting direction for the show, though. But yeah, I mean, so I do watch, like, one of the things that I paid close attention to with Succession is Logan Roy's own background. So there's a couple of scenes where they go to Scotland, right? And Logan is a self-made man. So Logan grew up in some rural backwater of Scotland. The show it doesn't even imply, it just basically straight up says that like Logan was abused as a kid. There's a scene in the very first season where Logan he's swimming and he exits the water and you see these scars on his back, like he was whipped. And he mentions this briefly to someone, but basically we're meant to believe that Logan as a kid was horribly mistreated, grew up in poverty in Scotland, and built this company out of nothing. And then all of his kids, who have been given basically every single advantage you can imagine, there's a scene early on where Kendall and I think Stewie, joke about how they both went to, I can't remember the name of the private, there's so many private schools, I don't remember all the names, but they went to a private school, then they went to Harvard, and, Kendall has his buddies who work at the Lampoon, And like, you know, they had like everything handed to them. And Logan and Kendall have a very tense interaction where Kendall says something along the lines of like, you gave your kids so much and now you despise us for it, that we had all these advantages that you never had. And, you know, I think Logan is a horrible man and a horrible person, but I understood Kendall when he said that to him. Like, I understood Logan's perspective, and this is why, like, all of the characters, there's no good person on Succession. Like, they have their good sides and their bad sides, but you know, on some level, like, I got where Logan was coming from and why he might somehow envy his own children. But yeah, I mean, there are other class elements as well here. The way that, so I think it was Kendall who brought some girl to one of the parties. I don't remember which party it was, but Kendall brought some girl over and he introduced her to Logan, and she kept just saying like, this is awesome, everything's awesome, like this party's awesome. And Logan glares at her like, this is like this person has no brain in their head. Like, why is my son dating this dumb person? And you know, within that environment, within that community, like you have to be on your game, right? Like, you have to be educated, you have to be socially adept and know how to communicate with people at that level. And yeah, that was like one of several other scenes, I think, where they underscore the class component here. One thing that I've been waiting to see, though, is technically all of the Roy kids in Succession are first generation college students, right? And so I wonder if like I guess there was that scene where they were about to purchase another media company where the families interacted with the Pierce. Do you remember the Pierce family? I think
they're like the Times, right? The Times.
No,
yeah. It's like,
actually, they're just like the family that owned the Wall Street Journal and sold it and sold
before Rupert Murdoch.
Yeah, and sold it.
Yeah, that's right. And they're this waspy old money family. I read this New Yorker article about Succession, and they talked about how, you know, the Logan Roy and his kids show up and they're wearing like, I can't remember, it was this like, you know, sleek business professional, like their attire, right? Yeah. Like black button down, you know, like black ball cap, like business, like they're all about business. And they get to the Pierce family, and the New Yorker, the writer of the New Yorker article said, like, you know, they were wearing shabby chic. You know, like the shirts were frayed, you know, like they come from such generational wealth that they no longer have to care, you know? Yeah. And I find that to be like this sort of clash between old money and new money. I really liked that episode too.
That you know, and I personally experienced that actually, because my grandfather was one of the richest people in the United States, who I'm very proud to say gave away 95% of his money during his own lifetime. So he was 50 years ahead of Gates and Buffett. But it was really weird because I certainly was born on third base. I'd even say I was born sliding into home plate. But
I've never heard that sliding home into home plate.
But certainly I got dealt a really great hand. And one of the things that like I found is, you know, it's kind of so I had that background, right? The old money, right? And like the whole thing that was drilled into me when I was a kid was where much is given, much is required. It was the old school values, right, of America. Like, noblesse oblige, where much is given, much is required. You have to set an example. It has to be good. You know, all of these things, these kind of rules, right? And then, like, I actually went broke because I spent money building the house I'm in right now for my wife when I moved here, and I didn't have any money. And it was like the first time in my life that had occurred. And then I was very lucky and fortunate in some of the companies that I started. But like, then you get into the debate, like, so how much of that is the social milieu that you're born into? How much of that is just genes? Like, if you look, I look at my cousins and they're all like entrepreneurs and they're all like we're all kind of doing things very much like our grandfather did. And so you kind of get to that question too. And like the old money versus new money. I mean, honestly, when the first Forbes 400 or whatever it was came out, it was almost all inherited money. And the money that was there that was not inherited was due to things, right? Steel, real estate, oil, railroads, all that kind of stuff. And like one of the reasons why I am so bullish on keeping things as open and free as possible for people to be entrepreneurs, for people to do new things, is like, look at the list now, man. It's all entrepreneurs pretty much. And like, it is not people like, in the old days, like the government could go after AT&T because everybody hated the fucking phone company, right? They could go after the power companies because everybody fucking hated them. I think that they would have a really hard time going against Bezos because everybody fucking loves Amazon. And so kind of the idea, though, is that obviously I'm doing a series on it. So I've been thinking like nothing but about this. We are moving into a world where government and the journalists that we were talking about earlier, right? Do you know why they're so mad? They're so mad because they don't have Walter Cronkite's influence.
Yeah.
You are absolutely right in that assessment. Cronkite goes negative on something, middle America totally goes with him, right? And now you see all of these histrionics, like the New York Times. Again, do I still take the Times? Yes, just out of habit, right? But like the New York Times is Pravda, and like they're willing to, but they did that for financial reasons, right? I get the business model.
Yeah, it's a good business model, right? Appeal to rich Northeasterners who want to be told what they like to be told.
Yeah, if I was the editor or the owner of the New York Times, I very likely might have to. No, I would never be able to do that. That's the problem. But like from a business point of view, it made sense, right? And the Journal kind of went the other way, and they're kind of libertarian, not so conservative. But like everybody is just pandering now, and
which is why Substack took off, right?
Bang, and that is why I am so bullish. I believe that 10 years from now, I won't have a single news service. I will have my own newspaper put together with now I happen to like to see things from people I disagree with, because I think you really always have to challenge your priors. And I've changed my mind on a lot of stuff, right? And you got to let them build a steel man, not a straw man, in my opinion. And so my newspapers might look very different than anyone else's, but my guess is it's going to be mostly like Substacks, and people are going to be able to like make a really good living from it. And that's kind of the key. It's like everyone's wringing their hands, right? And like we used to be able to do all of these things during the Great Compression after World War II, when like we were getting, our Gini quotient was getting a little out of hand. Of course, now it's totally out of control. And yet that's the Matthew effect, that's amplification, that's the Pareto 80-20, right? But
I think it's correcting itself to some degree, right? I mean, I'd written a few op-eds in the past and I enjoyed it. And I think, perhaps in like a, another life or another timeline, I would have sought that kind of profession, being a columnist somewhere. But yeah, I signed this deal with Substack, and I see like people like Trung and others who are just putting out this amazing content. And I'm grateful for it. I'm actually glad that we're kind of outside of the institutions where you don't have an editor over your shoulder and you're just able to speak what's on your mind and express your personality. And it's so much. I mean, I hardly ever read the op-ed pages of any major newspaper because Substack is so interesting.
That's a great point. Bingo. Yeah, I stopped reading the op-ed pages.
So did I. And look at this. We are three reasonably intelligent people. And what has happened is that Substack is superior, because you are out there with your Substack, both of you guys. I subscribe to both of you guys. But you're out there with why are people reading you? Because what you're writing about is really interesting, right? And so this whole idea of the gatekeeper, this whole idea of all of those, what I call the Vogon core here. If you're not familiar with Vogons, they were the most bureaucratic species in Doug Adams, the Hitchhiker's Guide Galaxy. So the Vogons were like the worst possible species around, and they like did everything by the book, and they had, so they're HR in essence. And essentially, like we have this fatted cat of administrators that are they have no idea what's going to happen to them. And like, we also have this group in America that has no idea if you watch Office Space, what would you say you do here? And like, so there's who wants to go back to the office? People who want to go back to the office they don't do anything. And so it's all about having meetings and busy, and like this confusion with, oh, I'm so busy, I got a lot of work done today. Yeah. You circle jerked with 5 other people from your same company, and essentially like patted each other on the back. Oh, Jim, you're doing such a great job. Thanks, Chris. Hey, what do you think, Patrick? Oh, yeah, we're really doing it. That's fucked up, man. If you really want to run a company, you don't do any of that shit. Like, you make meetings virtually illegal, and people who want to have them should be thrown into the darkness and gnashed and wail and gnash their teeth. But what's happening is that's happening, right? And I'm convinced that given the tools that we have now, it's not going to change just information. It's going to change a bunch of things. And the first time I thought about it was when they tried to do the hit job on George Bush, who I was not a supporter of, by the way. Let's get that out there. I thought I was, by the way, until I went back to an old journal and I realized I thought, yeah, I was in favor.
Not vote for this guy.
Yeah. It's like I was in favor of the first.
Rangers fan was not happy with his administration at the Rangers.
But anyway, the first inkling I got of what was coming was when I can't remember, probably the New York Times, tried to do a hit job on Bush that showed a letter, right, that was supposedly written in 60 blank. And within 2 hours of this massive hit piece, some crazy dude on the internet whose passion and hobby was fonts had published a piece saying that font on that letter did not exist in 1968. It was not invented until 1980, whatever. Whole thing immediately turns around and the focus gets put on the Times. And the same thing happened to Dan Rather. He got out.
Was that the National Guard? Like whether he fulfilled his service for the National Guard? Okay.
Yes. And so I'm reading this and I'm like, oh my God. Like all of the attempts of the elites who want to cling to their elite status, right, are going to just start falling because there's always going to be that guy who loves that crazy subgenre of something like fonts or whatever, who's going to be able to put actual evidence in place. That
something like this is going on right now with the Wall Street Journal, right? With Elon Musk and who's the guy's name? Sergey Brin. Oh, right. And so they post this article and then Elon Musk just tweets like, I just had dinner with Sergey Brin last night and whatever. I've never been alone with his wife. Like, what's going on here? And I read that piece of the Wall Street. I tweeted it and then I deleted the tweet once I saw Elon Musk because now I don't know what's true anymore. I never would have guessed. Like, I trust the Wall Street Journal. I don't know if I trust them anymore. But that was a very weird exchange that I saw.
I reread the article. Right? It was a whole the worst terms in journalism is people familiar with the matter. That's where I read the article again because after he said that, that's the thing, Rob. I'm echoing your point. I had this perception at the Times. I know the New York Times has jumped the shark, but the Wall Street Journal, I'm still like, this is like the Wall Street Journal. I'm like,
exactly. I was like, I haven't done that far.
Yeah. And then I read it, and I'm like, okay. Well, first, listen, I'm not saying. Listen, has Elon said things that turned out not to be true? Is his time? Yes, of course. How am I reading this? I'm like, I reread the article. I'm like, first of all, this is the Wall Street Journal. People are reading the Wall Street Journal for business news, for financial news, right? What is going on here? And I reread it, and I'm like, for a person familiar with the matter. And I'm like, this is crazy. On the second reread, I'm like, this is actually crazy.
It's nuts.
Yeah.
My wife has graduated summa cum laude in journalism. And we were joking about that one time. And I asked her, so am I right when I assume that when it says person familiar with the matter, the journalist is referring to themselves? And she goes, oh, yeah.
Because it's technically not a lie.
So you can just make shit up. Like, I mean, I'm going to write a Substack then, sources familiar with the matter, and then just write a hit piece on whoever I don't like that day.
That would be so funny. So funny. It's like, the whole Discordian religion got started as a prank. It was a prank of these guys in the 70s. They're like, what's the craziest, batshit craziest out there shit that we could do? They came up with Discordian, who actually was a real god back during the times of the Greek Eris, the god of mischief and chaos. Anyway, so they start this thing and it happened. And then they did another thing about Project Ultra, which was apparently, the CIA using LSD on people to do unspeakable things. Yeah. But then it was And so that came out. All right. I want to get us back to TV
Okay.
because people are going to be listening and like, what the fuck are these guys talking about? Let's go back to TV and let's talk about an observation that you made, Rob, earlier in the conversation. And that is the zeitgeist right now seems to be pretty cynical. It seems to be pretty, oh my God, I can't, So I think you're right, by the way. I saw that happen back in the late 70s. Like you guys weren't even born yet. Okay. So the 70s were like one of the worst decades for America, like ever. And by the way, with a lot of the same problems, right? Stagflation, the oil embargo. Everyone thought that Japan was just going to take over the entire world and that we were done, right? America was done.
Years. We had just withdrawn from a very unpopular war. I mean, similar with Vietnam, Afghanistan.
Exactly. Yeah. We lost a war. In the minds of Americans, America had never lost a war. We lost the War of 1812, but people don't remember that. And besides, it was against the British, our cousins.
/ Canada. Canada was a country. Canada wasn't a country.
That's right. But so I bring it up because all of the movies at that time were like that. Like in a traditional like hero's journey, he goes through all of the trials and tribulations, or she, but emerges successful. And here's the lesson that you can learn from it. Back then, like I'll try to put together a list of these movies and send them to you guys because they're kind of unwatchable, to be really honest. But you could flash forward to the end because in the end, the plane crashes and everyone dies. Right. And like these endings are just like such bummers. And like, it was just like, oh my God. Now, of course, there were great movies like Apocalypse Now being released at the same time. But the bulk of the conversations, the bulk of TV shows, the bulk of movies was in this just funk, right? And that the country would never, ever be able to turn the corner again. And of course, we all know what happened. Ronald Reagan gets elected. It's morning in America. Say what you will about that guy. He was a master at setting a scene and setting a mood. And like, even people who hated Reagan loved him. And it's like, I remember this thing where, and by the way, there was much more community and, getting along back then. Like Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House back then and a fiery Democrat, and Reagan, a conservative Republican, like they would shout at each other all day. And O'Neill would say, he's a monster and blah, blah. And Reagan never, by the way, that was another thing he never did. He never went negative. Ever. And he was always, I think that my esteemed colleague is wrong. But here's the key, right? At the end of the day, guess who had drinks together and had great yucks and laughs? O'Neill and Reagan. And so, but my point is, we're back into one of those kind of what I see as a spiral, but we have all of these new tools, all of these new leverage points that young people especially can like take advantage of that in my era, it took me like 6 months to set up the first company I founded in 1986 or 7. Now I can push a button, boom, everything. It's right there. So I think I'm very bullish on what's coming. I think that it's going to bum a lot of people out, especially the Vogon layer. But I definitely think that the gatekeepers are losing. The former elite journalists are spitting and just incredibly mad. Because the trade-off that they used to always make was, okay, we're not going to get paid a lot, but we matter. Worth the fourth estate, right?
Trading status for money.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Right. And now that status is gone, and I get it. What kind of TV shows do you guys think, and here's the kind of speculative part about going forward. First, you, and then you, Rob, like, if we were looking back and speculating, and of course we'll be wrong, so let me just get that out there right now. But it's fun to think about it. What kind of shows do you think, if we were time traveling 10 years into the future, Trung, what do you got? What do you think's going to have been?
If I'm going to guess,
big shows,
it's going to be depressing, and I'll tell you why. I agree with you that it's a dark time, and let's talk about one of the most popular shows amongst Gen Z, Euphoria on HBO. Extremely dark, right? So to your question of what does the next decade look like for television, the all-goers are going to run it. The studios are going to run it. The culture is centralizing. We're just going to be bombarded with these remakes, Marvel, Star Wars, spin-off after spin-off. Those will have the muscle and the all-goes behind them to break through consciously. I think we'll probably have one or two incredible shows that will be of the ilk of like a Breaking Bad or Succession. But I mean, I think it's not going to be great, to be honest, in the sense of there will be a lot of good stuff. But the thing I talked about earlier about what will actually be something I could talk to my neighbor about, or I know what 10 of my friends have seen. It's the same with the film industry, right? It's like the only movie from the last decade that I know I could talk to anybody about is like Endgame, Avengers Endgame, because I know they've seen it, right? Or there's a few of those. There's a handful of those, but I'm actually pretty cynical on what the next decade looks like, especially because streaming is getting clapped so hard. And I'll tell you a really bad thing about Netflix and kind of all goes running on entertainment in general is I had an opportunity to interview music historian Ted Gioia. And he's like, if you actually go on Netflix, they don't have a movie before basically the year 2000. They don't have that catalog anymore. So like, if you want to watch a good movie from the 60s, 70s, or 80s, it's likely not going to be on Netflix. Spotify, the most popular songs are old songs. People are latching on to older music, spending more time on old music. The new stuff that breaks through has no lasting power. So I'm actually pretty cynical for the next decade. I think there's going to be a lot of cookie cutter, franchise type stuff, similar with the film industry. Things will break through, but the thing that makes me sad is not having that shared kind of communal thing where you can watch something together and know that other people have seen it. That's my
that's an interesting point. Before I go to you, Rob, I will just say I can't talk a lot about it, but I am setting up companies, Trung, for 2023 when I am retired from asset management that are going to be actively betting against everything you just said.
Okay.
So we'll see who wins.
Yeah, well, I want you to win.
Hey,
Rob,
listen, man, I have no delusions. I always go into things, keeping in mind that I'll probably fuck something up in some way. I always do. So anyway, Rob, what do you think?
Well, Jim, you and I talked about that though. If my book does well, I mentioned, I think that this would be a good movie or miniseries. And I think, at least from what you've told me about your plans, I'm optimistic that people are doing things like that. And I think I'm generally slightly more optimistic than Trung about the future of movies in general, so I mentioned Eric Hoel's post earlier. He, in his Substack post about, how TV and pop culture is becoming more bleak, he has this meme you guys might have seen of there's 3 panels. In one panel, it's like, this little kid in like 1986 watching the Michael Keaton Batman. And he's like, oh, finally, a dark and gritty Batman. And then fast forward to 2005. And it's the Christopher Nolan, Christian Bale. And he's like, finally, a dark and gritty Batman. And then it fast forward to 2022 with the Robert Pattinson, the one that just came out. It's like, finally, a dark and gritty Batman.
Right.
And I remember thinking, like, at some point, like, are they just going to keep doing this? Like, every 8.5 years, they're going to come out with another dark and gritty Batman? Or are they going to finally, like... I know that there's this sort of like, at least with the Michael Keaton Batman, there was this backlash against the Adam West 1960s campy Batman. But I almost wonder if like they could bring that back somehow. Like, surely there's got to be a point where things start to swing back around. I mean, I just saw Top Gun Maverick with my girlfriend a couple weeks ago. And that movie is insanely popular. I don't know, it's like $800+ million around the world. It's got 90+% of Rotten Tomatoes from the critics and the audience, which is really rare nowadays to get high ratings from both of those categories. And Top Gun Maverick, and I watched it and it almost felt like anachronistic, like this movie of just like a straightforward good guy trying to do the right thing. Like, there's not even any villains. Like, there is a villain, but you don't even know who it is. Like, it's all about good people trying to do the right thing and no focus on the complexities of the adversaries. I guess I could kind of see going the other way where people will become so sick of the relentless darkness of TV and movies. But then again, I haven't seen Euphoria and I didn't realize how popular it was. So maybe things are just becoming so atomized and the markets are becoming so niche where everyone's just watching their own thing that I'm just not aware of what's going on anymore. But my feeling from speaking with young people, speaking here with undergrads at the university, is that like they want like upbeat and happy things. and they're watching like old sitcoms and TV shows from the 90s, and they're trying to find something, even like shows from their childhood, cartoons, where, you know, they're just like not relentlessly exposed to cynicism and darkness. But, you know, I hope that's what will happen anyway.
Well, actually, I want to add something to Rob's point about talking the atomization. I think that's really important, though. Is like, if you look at the next 10 years, the problem is that there's so much backlog of content where, like, if you're 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, growing up to 2020s and 2030s, you're going to want to watch The Office, right? Like, The Office is, I think I saw a crazy chart about the staying power of The Office. It's actually insane. It's Rob,
really
you've probably seen this, right? So,
yeah.
I mean, will it become what I talked about with Spotify? Are we just going to be retreading the old stuff? And the point that I left out of what Ted Joy was like, that actually is a massive sign of cultural stagnation when creativity, the creative industries are unable to create new stuff because that's their job to be creative. If the creative industry can't be creative, how is any other industry in the economy going to be creative? It's cultural rot, right? It's there's a whole, America is it's like the end of Rome, but that is part of it. Is like you keep going to the past. It's like my kid's gonna one day discover the Beatles, spend 2 years listening to it, and watch The Office, and not even care what is out in the year 2033, right? So what does that say about society? I think that's probably even bigger than this franchising of all content. Is the fact that there's no good stuff. Everybody just keeps going to the past, and I don't know what that says about society, but I feel like there's something wrong with.
So
would it be better if the studios announced that they're going to do a remake of The Office, or will that be like the final nail in the coffin of like, if we're remaking The Office, that's over?
It sounds like a middle ground though, where they remake it for the Slack generation. Like I can see something like that
of the 2020s. Yeah, that would be cool. Maybe.
Yeah,
for the work from home generation.
Yeah. So I am betting and not insignificant amount on the fact that pessimists sound smart and optimists make money. And so, if you wanted me to, man, I could go without notes. I could talk for 2 hours about why we're fucked. And I could be very compelling, and everyone would like walk away like the character from Arrested Development, the kid walking home. And I don't think we are. I think that it's not going to be like the 50s. I don't think that we're going to, at least probably not in my lifetime, and unless something radically changes, I don't think we're ever going to go back to that 50s, right? Where like the common view of the average, your idea, Trung, about talking to somebody about a movie that everyone had seen, right? I don't think we're going to go back to that. I think that we are going to have these sub-genres. We're going to have a group of people who are like super interested in whatever X is, right? And that they will be voracious in their appetite for taking that type of stuff in. I don't know how that gets translated to the broader culture, but it will, it'll poke it. Some things will go viral, right?
Some things will break through. Absolutely.
And some things will break through. And then the major film companies will say, hey, wait a minute. How are this new company over here making money, making these feel good movies? Maybe we better go into that. Like, because that's another one of my maxims, right? If I think that I've got the new thing, right? And like I bring it to market and 18 months later, I don't have any competitors, I'm wrong. Yeah. I don't have the new thing, because say what you want about free markets, they are ruthlessly efficient. And like, just look at how, and they don't like it, but just look at how quickly Hollywood and big business and everything co-opted every like movement, even the anti-Hollywood, anti-big business, they just co-opt it. I mean, they're like the board, man. They can just come in and do it. Okay, so inception time, guys. I asked you both this question previously, so maybe you'll have something different for me this time. We're gonna make you the emperor of the world, and you get to incept an earworm in everyone in the population. They're gonna wake up the next day and they're gonna think that they thought of this great idea, and they're gonna start doing, thinking, or learning X. Trung, go for it, man.
Everybody watch Apocalypse Now at least once in your life. No, I'll say something related. Hey, find a piece of content that you have on your list that you've been planning to do that's a little bit challenging, and actually start, because I personally have a few myself. I've started Infinite Jest probably 100 times, never finished it. I started the movie 2001 100 times, never finished it. And I owe it to myself to try to read or do one of those works that's a little bit challenging, even though I could just be on Twitter doing memes all day and having people like it. So I would say that. Challenge yourself with art.
I love that one.
Oh, man.
By the way, both of those are 2001, man. You got to remember that he didn't have special effects. So when you get to the scene where he's jogging on the gyroscope, he built that fucker.
That's how he faked the moon landing for us, right? Stanley Kubrick faked the moon landing. So
exactly. All right, Tom, you're up.
Okay, so first, I forgot you asked these questions, Jim. I listened to your podcast, and then I go on and I forget that you asked this. You got to challenge your audience, like your guests. And so one thing that had come to mind that I wanted to bring up earlier, but I guess I could sort of shoehorn it in here, which would be to also broaden your content horizons and also watch movies and TV from outside of Hollywood. I've noticed I started watching action and suspense and dramas and so forth from like Hong Kong dramas or like Korean cinema. I watched Parasite back when it was literally right before the pandemic kicked off. I saw Parasite in the theaters with my girlfriend, and then I just started watching all of these other Korean dramas, and I was like, these are really good. And I'm realizing that I think what's going on is the writers there, and I've listened to some screenwriters who have taught people in other countries, like screenwriters in other countries, like Hollywood screenwriters will sell their classes and stuff. They'll basically just give them the straightforward Hollywood script, like the hero's journey type of script, and people in other cultures will just run with it, and they don't feel this pressure to impress critics the way that American Hollywood filmmakers do, where you have to subvert or disrupt the audience expectation. Oh, the good guy was actually the bad guy all along, or try to play with audience expectations like that. They're very comfortable just showing a straightforward conventional film. And I like those. I don't always have to have, some subversion of my expectations. And I like watching movies that play it straight in that way. So I guess that would be mine, is to start watching or start considering to watch movies and TV from outside of the American context.
I think that's a great one. And it echoes what Trug and I were talking about on our first podcast together, the importance of travel and the ability to open your mind to things that you just don't literally have never experienced. So I think that's a beautiful one. Yeah. Just sometimes I will read only newspapers from outside of the United States. And it's really interesting because the perspective change.